Seattle, 2018. A year of quiet rain, quiet nights, and a quiet marriage hiding a story no one saw coming. In the northern stretch of the city, where the sidewalks glistened every morning with a fine mist, and the homes, perched along tree-lined streets, carried the modest confidence of an upper-middle-class neighborhood, Emma Parker lived a life that most would describe as stable. But stability, as this story would show, has a way of disguising fractures. Emma was 32, gentle in the way she moved through the world, careful in the way she spoke, and guarded in the way she allowed herself to feel. She worked part-time at a small design firm in Fremont, where she specialized in layout work she seldom talked about with anyone. Even those who knew her rarely knew her well. She was the kind of woman who blended into the soft rhythms of Seattle life. A neatly kept home, predictable routines, and a marriage that looked intact from a distance. But like many things that look whole from the outside, the truth was far more complicated. Her husband, Daniel Parker, was 38, employed at a local insurance company, and the man whose presence filled a room even when he said nothing. He wasn't loud or cruel in an overt sense, not in ways that would catch the attention of neighbors or friends. Instead, he was controlled, precise, and intentionally reserved. He approached life like a series of tasks to be managed efficiently, and he expected the relationship with his wife to operate with the same mechanical order. Within the quiet confines of their home, a modest, two-story structure constructed in the early 1990s, filled with neutral colors and careful symmetry, the couple moved like two people committed to the idea of marriage rather than to each other. Conversations were transactional. Evenings passed in the comfortable dullness of routine. Emma cooked, Daniel read. They shared the same spaces but rarely shared themselves. The affection that once flickered between them early in their marriage had cooled into something tepid, something perfunctory, something like a habit. For years, Emma tried to convince herself that this was normal, that marriages didn't need constant light to stay alive. But somewhere under the surface, she began to feel the weight of her own silence pressing against her ribs. She felt the presence of her unspoken thoughts piling up behind her eyes, threatening to spill out. And she felt the ache of wanting, not for extravagance or escape, but simply to be known. In moments when Daniel wasn't home, she walked the hallways searching for something she couldn't name. Sometimes she stood by the living room window, watching the rain roll down the glass like 1,000 quiet confessions. Sometimes she stood by the old vertical utility chase, hidden behind an access panel near the hallway closet. A narrow mechanical shaft the previous homeowners had mentioned in passing, built to house a tangle of pipes and ventilation conduits running vertically between floors. It wasn't large, certainly not built for human use, but there was something eerie about the idea that the walls themselves held space unseen by everyday life. A hollow interior, a cavity no one ever considered, a place where light didn't reach. It felt, in some strange way, familiar. Emma began seeking solace where she could find it, in small escapes, in late-night hours when Daniel fell asleep early, in spaces where she could let herself breathe without anyone watching. And eventually, that small search for relief led her into the vast, anonymous world of online communities. Forums, discussion groups, creative spaces, corners of the internet where people spoke plainly, without the performance required in real life. She didn't sign up looking for connection, she signed up looking for air. And yet, connection found her. It started with a simple conversation thread about personal authenticity. An exchange of stories from strangers scattered across the world. Emma typed a hesitant message about what it meant to feel invisible in one's own life, about the emotional dissonance of playing a role that no longer fit. She didn't name her marriage. She didn't describe her loneliness. She only brushed gently at the edges of her reality, hoping someone would understand the outline. Among the responses was one from a woman named Lina. At first, it was nothing more than a thoughtful comment, warm, perceptive, and unmistakably sincere. The tone stood out. It didn't feel like someone offering platitudes or quick reassurances. It felt like someone who had paused, considered Emma's words, and responded with the gravity of someone who recognized what it meant to carry unspoken truths. Emma found herself reading that message again and again. Over the following days, their exchanges became more frequent. They drifted from a public conversation thread to private messages, and from private messages to longer, more personal reflections late at night when the rest of Seattle lay still behind curtains of rainfall. Emma learned that Lina was 30, working as a community outreach coordinator and living alone in a small apartment near Capitol Hill. She learned that Lina was known by her friends for her warmth, not a performative charm, but a steady, grounded kindness that made people feel seen. She shared fragments of her life with openness Emma wasn't accustomed to witnessing. She talked about her passions, her challenges, her hopes for the future. There was no defense in her tone, no guardedness, no hesitation. She spoke the way some people breathe, naturally, without fear. And for reasons Emma couldn't fully explain, she found herself drawn irresistibly to that light. For the first time in years, Emma felt the edges of her world expanding. These exchanges grew into a kind of ritual. After Daniel went to bed, Emma sat quietly in the living room with her laptop open and the soft hum of Seattle rain tapping at the windows. She and Lina talked about everything and nothing, about the city, about the weight of expectations, about the private truths that often remained locked behind polite conversation. There was no judgment, no requirement to perform, no need to be small. And slowly, Emma found herself revealing parts of her life she had never uttered aloud. The loneliness, the emotional disconnection, the feeling of living beside someone rather than with them. She didn't paint Daniel as villainous. She didn't blame him for everything she felt. She simply described a marriage that had become an echo chamber, a place where two people moved without ever touching. Lina never pushed her, never demanded more. Instead, she listened, truly listened, and offered space for Emma to speak without fear. They began discussing identity, emotional truth, and the delicate complexities of love that didn't fit into tidy categories. And as those late-night conversations unfolded, Emma realized she wasn't just finding comfort, she was finding clarity. Clarity about who she was, what she needed, and what she had been too afraid to name. In those quiet digital moments, a bond formed. Not the kind that erupted quickly, but the kind that grew quietly, naturally, like something long overdue. It wasn't reckless or careless. It was careful, tender, and deeply respectful. A connection between two women that wasn't defined by sensationalism or taboo, but by the simple human need for truth and closeness. Emma found herself waiting for Lina's messages throughout the day. She found herself smiling at her screen, laughing softly, noticing moments of brightness she hadn't felt in years. Lina's presence became a lifeline, not an escape from her marriage, but a pathway toward understanding herself. Still, Emma told no one. She moved through her daily life with the same quiet precision, performing the same tasks, maintaining the same routines. Daniel noticed none of her subtle glow, none of the quiet shifts in her posture or the softer light in her eyes. Their marriage remained functional but distant, unchanged on the surface, a facade held aloft by habit and mutual silence. But Emma felt the difference. The interior of her life was changing, and in a house where the walls held hidden spaces, cavities no one visited, vertical chases that concealed the inner workings of the home, she began to see parallels between the architecture surrounding her and the architecture of her own emotional world.
There were parts of her life that had remained concealed for years, parts that never saw the light, parts that had always been there, waiting for the moment she would finally open the panel and peer inside. What she found wasn't emptiness, it was possibility. What began as late-night conversations soon grew into an unspoken understanding, one that Emma approached with caution, reverence, and the profound knowledge that this connection meant more than she was ready to admit. Yet it didn't frighten her. It felt honest. It felt right. It felt like the first breath after years of holding one's lungs tightly shut.
Seattle's winter deepened. The nights grew longer, and inside that modest house, on a quiet street where neighbors walked dogs under dim street lamps and the soft glow of living room windows made every home appear peaceful, Emma's life shifted course. She didn't know yet that her connection with Lina Rivera would soon spark a chain of events that investigators would later piece together with painstaking detail. She didn't know that her own silence, guilt, and fear would eventually place her at the center of a storm she never intended to create. And she certainly didn't know that Lina, warm, bright, vibrant Lina, would become a name whispered with the haunting weight of mystery for years to come. She only knew that for the first time in a long time, she felt seen, and the quiet life she once accepted without question was beginning, subtly and irrevocably, to unravel. In the weeks that followed, the connection between Emma Parker and Lina Rivera deepened with a quiet inevitability. Not explosive, not dramatic, but steady and sincere, like a river carving a path through stone. No one noticed the shift taking place within Emma, not even Daniel, whose days had become an endless loop of work, routine, and the predictable patterns of a life long since settled into place. But inside Emma's private world, the one she kept tucked behind the glow of her laptop screen, everything was changing. It began with long conversations that stretched past midnight. Emma, sitting cross-legged on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket with the rain whispering against the windows, found herself opening up to Lina with a candor she had never afforded anyone else. She wrote about her quiet dissatisfaction, not in bitterness, but in longing. She wrote about feeling unseen in her own life, unheard in her own home, and uncertain whether she had ever known how to ask for more. Lina responded not with solutions, but with understanding. An understanding that came from someone who had lived her own truths with honesty even when the world asked her to shrink. She shares stories of her youth growing up in a large, boisterous Mexican-American family in Guayacama, where affection was abundant, but expectations were tightly drawn. She spoke about the first time she recognized her identity, not as a revelation, but as a quiet certainty she had carried for years before speaking it aloud. She described leaving home at 19 to find a life where she could live without apology. Her words carried warmth, fluid and effortless. There was something disarming about the way she spoke, confident without arrogance, gentle without fragility. She understood the complexities of emotion with a natural empathy that made people feel safe in her orbit. And Emma, who had spent years burying her own truths beneath layers of politeness and self-restraint, found herself unfolding in her presence. Their messages grew longer. The tone shifted, gradually, then unmistakably, from simple companionship to genuine affection. Not flirtation, not performance, something deeper, something that neither of them forced, yet both of them felt. They talked about books, favorite cafes in Capitol Hill, the sound of ferries crossing Elliott Bay at night. They spoke about identity and emotional honesty, about the dignity of living as one's full self, about the small rebellions that define a life. Lina asked questions with remarkable insight, prompting Emma to reflect on aspects of herself she had ignored for years. Emma, in turn, found herself drawn to Lina's courage, not the loud kind, but the quiet determination to live truthfully in a world that often punished authenticity. Their bond strengthened like a bridge built plank by plank, each conversation laying another piece across the distance between them. Emma began waking in the morning not with dread for the day's routines, but with anticipation for the moment she could check her messages.
She caught herself smiling at her phone, her heart warming at the sight of Lina's name appearing on the screen. It wasn't simply attraction, though the spark of intimacy grew undeniably between them. It was connection, a recognition, a shared emotional language Emma had never spoken, even in her marriage. But even as the relationship grew, Emma remained cautious. She kept their conversations hidden, not from shame, but from fear. Fear of the disruption that honesty would unleash. Fear of confronting truths she had avoided for years. Fear of losing the steady facade of her life. She didn't know how to bring her feelings for Lina into the world beyond that glowing screen. She didn't know if she could. But late at night, when Daniel slept, and the house hummed with the low mechanical sounds of pipes and ventilation shafts behind the walls, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she didn't have to choose silence. One evening, Lina asked a question that shifted their dynamic in a subtle but profound way. She asked Emma what she truly wanted, not from her marriage, not from her career, not from society, but from her life. Emma stared at the screen for a long time before responding. She hesitated because she was afraid of the answer, and she was afraid of the relief that came with naming it. Eventually, she typed, "I want to feel real." Lina responded almost immediately. Her message was simple. You are real, even when you hide it from yourself. It was the kind of response that felt like a hand reaching through the dark, steady, warm, unwavering. From that point on, their conversations grew more personal, more revealing. Emma began sharing memories, moments from her past she had locked away. She spoke about the early years of her marriage, when everything looked perfect but felt hollow beneath the surface. She described the slow drift between her and Daniel, the absence of intimacy, the years spent pretending the distance didn't hurt. Lina didn't condemn Daniel. She didn't rush to paint him as the antagonist in Emma's story. Instead, she focused on Emma, on her feelings, her unmet needs, her right to seek truth in her own life. There was no judgment in her words, only understanding. Over time, Emma learned more about Lina's everyday life. She learned about the small plant-lined balcony where Lina drank her morning coffee. She learned about the local youth center where Lina volunteered. She learned about her habit of walking through Cal Anderson Park at dusk, admiring the way the streetlights created golden trails across wet pavement. These details painted a vivid portrait of a woman who lived with openness, who embraced the world rather than shrinking from it. And as Emma grew closer to that light, she began to feel the quiet pull of something she had never allowed herself to experience, the possibility of love. Still, they tread carefully, respectfully. They talked openly about Emma's marriage, about her identity, about the complexities of longing for someone while entangled in commitments that no longer nurtured her. Their connection was never portrayed as a betrayal, but as an evolution, a slow recognition of truths that had been waiting in Emma's heart long before Lina appeared. And Lina, for her part, never pushed for more than Emma could give. She understood the delicacy of the situation, the emotional risks, the need for patience. She responded with empathy and boundaries, reminding Emma that her safety, emotional and otherwise, mattered more than anything. But despite the caution, the bond between them deepened into something unmistakable. Emma began taking long drives after work under the pretense of running errands. In reality, she parked near Lake Union or in quiet residential streets just to talk to Lina on her phone, to hear her voice, to feel her presence cut through the static of the life she no longer wanted to live. Their conversations were never rushed. They drifted naturally, blending humor and vulnerability in equal measure. There were nights when Emma confessed fears she had never spoken aloud, fear of disappointing her family if she left her marriage, fear of starting over at 32, fear of Daniel's emotional rigidity and how he might react to change. Lina listened with a patience that never faltered. And slowly, Emma began to feel her own courage expanding, like a lighthouse emerging through fog. The moment that brought their connection fully into focus came during a slow, rainy evening in February. Emma, sitting alone in the dimly lit living room, confessed something that had been building for weeks. She felt something for Lina that she didn't have words for, something profound, something that terrified her and comforted her at the same time. Lina's response was gentle, steady. She said she cared for Emma, not carelessly, not impulsively, but with honesty and respect. She acknowledged the depth of their connection, while emphasizing that Emma's emotional safety mattered more than anything. There was dignity in their exchange, mutual respect, a shared understanding that love, real love, wasn't something to exploit or sensationalize. It was something to honor, even in its uncertainty. From that night onward, the air between them carried a quiet tenderness, not always spoken, often implied, but undeniably present. For Emma, the relationship became an anchor, something that pulled her to her own truth, something that reminded her she deserved to feel seen, wanted, understood. Her heart awakened in ways she had long believed impossible. But the stronger the connection grew, the more she felt the fragile tension between her inner world and the life she continued to present to Daniel. She tried to maintain normalcy, cooking dinners, managing small household tasks, engaging in brief surface-level conversations that skimmed the surface of a marriage already fractured by silence. Daniel noticed none of the internal shift, or perhaps he did, but dismissed it. To him, Emma's quietness was routine. Her emotional restraint was expected. He had never looked beyond the stillness to see what might lie beneath. But beneath the surface, everything was changing. Emma was changing. And that transformation, the unfolding of a woman finding herself after years of quiet suppression, set the stage for what would come next. A visit, a moment, a single decision that would alter the course of all their lives. But for now, in those quiet winter weeks of 2018, Emma allowed herself to breathe in the warmth of Lina's presence, a warmth that felt like truth, a warmth that illuminated the shadows she had lived in for too long, a warmth that she didn't know soon would collide with danger.
By early March of 2018, Seattle had begun its reluctant transition from winter to spring. The rain still fell with a steady rhythm, but small moments of sunlight occasionally slipped between the clouds, scattering warmth across the cold pavement. Life on Emma Parker's quiet residential street carried on as it always had. Dog walkers in bundled jackets, neighbors tending to soaked garden beds, commuters waiting at bus stops under umbrellas the color of bruised skies. Inside Emma's home, however, the atmosphere had shifted into something fragile and restless. Her connection with Lina had grown into a quiet gravitational pull that Emma felt every moment of the day. It was no longer a distant companionship that lived inside a laptop screen. It had become something real, something present, something that felt like the first true step toward living authentically. Yet authenticity came with risk, and Emma knew it. She had never invited Lina to her home. She had never dared. While she often imagined seeing Lina face to face, speaking to her in the same room rather than through a glowing screen, the reality of Daniel's unpredictable presence made such a meeting nearly impossible. Daniel's schedule was irregular. His church activities sometimes pulled him away for long stretches, but he had a habit of returning home unexpectedly, sometimes to retrieve a forgotten book, sometimes because a meeting ended early, sometimes simply because he wanted to. His temperament wasn't explosive, but it was demanding in its own quiet, suffocating way. He expected predictability. He expected order. He expected his world to remain exactly as he understood it. For weeks, Emma avoided the thought of bringing Lina to her house, but in early March, the opportunity finally presented itself. Daniel announced he would be spending the afternoon and evening at the church preparing for an upcoming community event. He left the house around noon, dropping a familiar comment about wanting a productive day. For Emma, the hours that followed hummed with nervous anticipation. She had told Lina about Daniel's schedule. She had told her that, for once, the house would be empty for several uninterrupted hours. Both women felt an undeniable pull to meet in person, not out of impulse,
but out of a desire to solidify the bond that had grown far beyond anything either of them had expected. Lina agreed to visit, but cautiously. She wanted to respect Emma's marriage even as their connection deepened, and she wanted to ensure Emma felt safe and grounded in her choices. Emma, nervous but certain, assured her that the timing was right. Around 2:15 p.m., Lina arrived. Emma opened the door with a trembling mix of excitement and fear. There, standing on her porch in a dark jacket and jeans dampened by the rain, was Lina Rivera, the woman who had illuminated the quiet corners of her life for months. She looked exactly as Emma had imagined. Warm eyes that softened immediately at the sight of her, a gentle posture, an aura of grounded sincerity. Seeing her in person felt like stepping into sunlight after years spent indoors. They entered the home quietly. There was no expectation of anything beyond presence. The simple act of meeting, of sharing space, of allowing their connection to occupy a physical room rather than a digital one. Emma made tea. Lina walked softly through the living room, taking in the home with a polite curiosity. The atmosphere was peaceful, intimate, and unhurried. They spoke quietly at the kitchen table, their voices barely above a whisper, not out of secrecy, but out of reverence for the moment. Emma felt more alive in those minutes than she had in years. But life, as Emma would later describe to investigators, does not allow happiness to unfold without interruption. At 3:07 p.m., everything changed. A car door slammed outside. Then another. Emma froze. The color drained from her face so quickly that Lina immediately reached out, instinctively concerned. Emma stepped to the window, careful not to be seen, and peered through the sheer curtains. Daniel was home. His car sat in the driveway, rain collecting on its roof like 1,000 tiny warnings. He was already halfway up the walk, rummaging for his house keys. Emma turned toward Lina with a look of pure terror. The quiet illusion of safety shattered in a single instant. There was no time to think, no time to explain, no time to consider polite solutions or rational explanations. Emma felt her pulse thundering in her ears. "He can't see you," she whispered, not as dialogue, but as a desperate truth pulsing through her mind. The house offered very few hiding places. The closets were too shallow. Under the bed was impossible. The garage door made too much noise, and Daniel, methodical in his habits, would immediately notice anything out of place. But then Emma remembered the utility chase, the narrow vertical mechanical shaft that ran between the floors, the hidden cavity behind a small access panel near the hallway closet, a space built for pipes and ventilation lines, not for people, but still large enough for a determined adult to squeeze into if they were careful. Emma hurried to the hallway, her hands shaking as she pulled aside the vacuum cleaner and laundry baskets that partially blocked the access panel. Lina understood immediately, her breath tightening with dread. She had seen the panel earlier and commented on how unusual it was, but she had never imagined she would be asked to hide inside it. The panel was only about 18 inches wide. Behind it, the vertical shaft dropped downward into darkness and extended upward into the unseen cavities between floors. The walls were lined with metal pipes, dusty insulation, and the faint scent of aging wood and stagnant air. Emma pulled the panel open. A draft of cold, stale air escaped, carrying with it the sensation of a place untouched for years. There was no time for fear, no time for discussion. Daniel's key turned in the lock. Lina stepped into the narrow opening, twisting her shoulders to fit into the shaft. She pressed her back against a vertical pipe and drew her knees close to avoid bumping anything that might cause a sound. The space was claustrophobic, barely enough room to breathe without touching the walls. The darkness swallowed her instantly. Emma closed the panel, her hands trembling so violently she struggled to align it with the frame. The front door opened. Daniel entered with the heavy, measured steps of a man accustomed to the sound of his own authority. Emma forced herself to breathe evenly as she stepped away from the access panel, her heart slamming against her ribs. Daniel greeted her without warmth. His tone was flat, mildly annoyed. He said he'd forgotten his laptop charger. Emma nodded, trying to appear calm, but the room felt unbearably small. Every sound was magnified. The rustle of Daniel's coat, the soft thud of his shoes against the hardwood floor, the click of a light switch. Inside the walls, Lina held her breath. The darkness pressed in on her from all sides. She could barely move. The vertical shaft felt like a tomb, narrow, cold, and suffocating. Dust clung to her clothes. The pipes beside her vibrated faintly with the distant hum of the home's mechanical systems. She could hear everything happening outside the panel, every footstep, every murmur. Emma attempted small talk, her voice thin and strained. Daniel responded with suspicion, though he said nothing overtly confrontational. He walked through the house, retrieving what he needed, but his movements became slower, more deliberate. He paused in doorways. He scanned the room as though sensing a disturbance. He asked Emma why she looked pale. She said she didn't feel well, that she had been resting. Daniel wasn't convinced. His footsteps moved toward the hallway. Emma felt her stomach drop. Daniel lingered near the closet, only inches from the panel behind which Lina hid. Emma forced herself to keep breathing evenly. The silence stretched, almost unbearable. Lina, unable to see anything in the pitch-black shaft, imagined Daniel's figure standing on the other side of the panel. Imagine him noticing the slight shift in the objects beside it. Imagine him pulling it open. But he didn't. After a long moment, Daniel finally retrieved his laptop charger from the bedroom. He mentioned he needed to return to the church, that he was running behind. He walked toward the door with slow, heavy steps, the kind that suggested he was leaving reluctantly, as if something in the house still felt out of place to him. Emma waited at the top of the stairs, holding her breath as Daniel descended. The sound of the front door opening and closing echoed through the house like an exhale. A car engine started, then faded. Only after the silence settled did Emma rush back to the hallway. She pulled the access panel open with trembling hands. Lina emerged slowly, carefully, her face pale, her clothes dusty, her breath shallow. Her eyes trembled with adrenaline. Emma helped her out of the now space. They didn't embrace. They didn't speak. There was no time for emotional processing. Both women knew the house was no longer safe. Daniel could return again at any moment. Emma urged Lina to leave quickly and quietly. Rather than walking out the front door, Lina made the decision to climb up through the chase to the second floor, where the shaft connected to another maintenance access point near the attic. From there, she could exit through the small crawlspace door that led to the side yard. It was risky, but it minimized the chance of crossing Daniel's path. Lina climbed upward, steadying herself on the pipes and framework inside the dark shaft, inching slowly toward the dim light filtering through a small seam above. The climb was terrifying, but she made it.
She slipped through the crawlspace door, crept along the narrow exterior path, and disappeared into the rain-soaked afternoon. She escaped safely. Emma closed the panel again, leaning her forehead against the wall, trembling with the mix of fear, adrenaline, and guilt. She didn't know then that the events of that afternoon would set off a chain reaction, one that would escalate into suspicion, anger, confrontation, and ultimately a mystery the city of Seattle would struggle to unravel for years to come. But in that moment, all she knew was relief. Relief that Lina was alive. Relief that Daniel hadn't discovered the truth. Relief that the walls of her home, with their hidden shafts and silent cavities, had concealed a secret just long enough to keep disaster at bay. For now.
Part 4. After the Escape. Lina Rivera left Emma Parker's home in the same manner she had entered it, quietly, cautiously, and unseen by the neighborhood that continued going about its rainy afternoon as if nothing unusual had occurred behind those walls. She stepped out into the cold air with her heart pounding, her hands still trembling from the claustrophobic ascent through the narrow utility chase. Her jacket was speckled with dust. Her hair carried the faint scent of old insulation. A smear of gray streaked her sleeve where she'd brushed against a pipe. But she was safe. She paused at the side of the house to steady herself. The world seemed louder now. The hiss of passing tires on wet pavement, the distant call of a dog, the steady patter of rain on the hood of her jacket. After the crushing silence inside the hidden shaft, everything felt amplified. She took a long breath and then hurried toward the sidewalk, keeping her head down, her footsteps quick and deliberate. No one noticed her. No one paid attention to the young woman moving swiftly up the block. And within minutes, Lina disappeared into the city, swallowed by the ordinary rhythms of Seattle life. When she reached her apartment, she finally allowed herself to collapse onto her couch, shaking from adrenaline and disbelief. Her living room, usually a sanctuary of warm lights and potted plants, felt strangely unfamiliar. Too bright, too open. She sat in stillness, replaying the last hour in her mind. The unexpected arrival, the frantic hiding, the darkness of the shaft, the brush of cold pipes against her skin, the heavy footsteps inches away. She didn't feel angry. She didn't blame Emma. She understood the fear that had propelled everything. But she felt shaken, deeply, undeniably shaken, in a way she couldn't ignore. Emma, meanwhile, stood in the hallway of her home long after Lina escaped, staring at the closed access panel. The house felt unbearably quiet. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the walls had absorbed the tension and now radiated it back in slow waves. She pressed her hands to her face, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. She had nearly lost everything. She had nearly exposed Lina to Daniel in a moment she couldn't even fully explain. She had taken a risk she never should have taken. And the weight of that realization settled into her bones like cold rain. For the next several days, Emma moved through her life with a deliberate effort to appear normal. But normalcy had become a fragile performance. Daniel noticed. He saw her distant expression. He saw the distracted way she prepared dinner, the way her hands occasionally trembled, the way she seemed lost in thoughts she refused to share. He saw her phone face down on the table more often. He saw her hurriedly locking the screen when he walked into the room. At first, he asked small questions, nothing overtly suspicious, just comments about whether she was feeling well, whether she was overwhelmed at work, whether something was on her mind. Emma responded with rehearsed calmness, but the tremor beneath her answers was noticeable. Daniel was a man who lived by patterns, and when patterns broke, he noticed. He became attuned to every shift in her behavior. He watched quietly, evaluating. He lingered in doorways a moment longer than necessary. He stood behind her without announcing his presence. He checked her phone's charging habits, the speed with which she closed her laptop, the tone she used when saying goodnight. Emma felt his observation even when he said nothing. She grew tense. Her sleep fractured into restless stretches. She woke in the middle of the night with the sensation of being watched, even when Daniel was asleep beside her. In moments of heightened anxiety, her mind drifted back to the utility chase, the narrow enclave in the wall that had nearly concealed disaster. She avoided walking near it for days, as though the panel itself might trigger the memory of Daniel's footsteps inches away. Lina tried to keep her distance for Emma's sake. In their conversations, she urged Emma to focus on safety, to stay grounded, to avoid any confrontation until she felt firmly in control of her circumstances. Lina's messages remained warm, steady, and patient. She didn't push to see Emma again. She didn't ask for more than Emma could offer. She only made it clear that she cared, deeply, sincerely, and that Emma's well-being mattered above all else. But being apart didn't lessen the emotional connection between them. It only intensified the realization that their bond was more than circumstance or digital correspondence. It was real. It was powerful. And both women sensed it had reached a turning point. But Daniel only sensed the disruption. He noticed the change in Emma's emotional availability, the absence of warmth that was once muted but still present. The shift wasn't a sudden rupture, but a quiet erosion, a growing distance he couldn't explain and she couldn't hide. Some evenings, he walked into the room to find Emma staring at her phone with a subtle expression, not longing, not sadness, but something contemplative, something vulnerable, a look he had never seen her give him, a look he didn't understand. He asked her who she was talking to. She laughed softly and said it was no one. That answer settled badly in him, not because he had any concrete evidence of wrongdoing, but because the emotional space between them had become unfamiliar. He felt it widening in ways he couldn't articulate. Daniel began checking small things, subtle things. He glanced at her phone when she wasn't looking. He noticed that she deleted message threads frequently, something she hadn't done before. He listened at the bedroom door when she lingered downstairs after he went to bed. He paid attention to her expression when her phone vibrated in another room. Nothing he found was definitive, but everything felt wrong. Emma sensed his scrutiny. She continued trying to maintain the appearance of normal life, but her attempts were clumsy. She became quieter, more distant. She forgot small tasks, misplaced items, flinched when Daniel entered a room unexpectedly. Her emotions lived just behind a trembling surface. Meanwhile, Lina kept her distance physically, but remained emotionally connected. She urged Emma to take care of herself, to seek clarity, to reflect on her safety and her truth. She never asked Emma to choose between her marriage and their connection. She only offered her honesty and the assurance that she cared for Emma without condition. That respect, that sincerity, strengthened Emma's feelings, but it also expanded her fear. She knew Daniel. She knew his rigidity, his intolerance for unpredictability, his discomfort with emotional ambiguity. And she feared that if he discovered her connection with Lina, even in its most innocent form, he would respond with suspicion and anger. The tension in the Parker household didn't explode. It simmered. Emma felt it in every room, a quiet, watchful pressure that followed her like a shadow. Daniel's tone remained even, but it carried an undercurrent of mistrust. His questions became more pointed. His gaze lingered too long. 2 weeks after the incident in which Lina hid in the utility chase, Daniel confronted Emma about her withdrawn behavior. He didn't accuse her of anything. He simply asked with measured calmness if there was something she needed to tell him. Emma shook her head. She didn't lie with elaborate stories. She simply offered silence. And Daniel, hearing only that silence, began filling in the blanks himself. His unease grew each day. He became restless at work, distracted. He began driving home early without explanation. He checked in more frequently, calling Emma during the day with questions about errands, dinner, her schedule. He began attending fewer church events, choosing instead to return home and sit in the living room, observing Emma with eyes that tried to decode her every movement. Emma felt the pressure building, not physically, but emotionally, psychologically. The walls of the house, once just a backdrop to her life, now felt tight around her. The mechanical hum behind the utility chase seemed louder, the shadows in the hallway deeper. She had the constant sense that something unseen was inching toward fracture. Lina sensed it too. In her messages, she urged Emma to consider speaking with a counselor or a trusted friend. Emma refused, too afraid of what she might reveal, too afraid of breaking the fragile balance holding everything together. Still, Lina remained patient. She didn't push for another meeting. She didn't ask for more than Emma could safely give. She respected Emma's boundaries with quiet dignity, even as the space between them weighed heavily on both of them. But Emma didn't disappear from Daniel's awareness. She made her more visible.
He watched every small change with increasing suspicion. The long pauses before answering questions, the late-night messages she claimed were nothing, the faint tremor in her voice when he asked simple things. He noticed she had begun spending more time alone outside the house, running errands, taking walks, claiming she needed fresh air.
He followed her once, staying far behind, his curiosity edged with fear. He didn't discover anything concrete, but he discovered enough to feel threatened. Emma didn't know yet how close Daniel was to unraveling the truth. She didn't know how deeply he had begun investigating the shifts in her life, and she certainly didn't know the extent to which one near discovery, the afternoon Lina hid in the forgotten cavity between walls, had altered everything in Daniel's perception. What began as suspicion had grown into something sharper, something tangled with emotion and pride and fear. And fear, as investigators often later remarked, is a powerful catalyst. The quiet tension inside the Parker home was about to ignite into something far more dangerous, something no one saw coming.
The tension in Emma and Daniel Parker's home did not erupt in a single moment. It built quietly, layer upon layer, until the weight of unspoken truths became something neither of them could ignore. Emma felt it every time Daniel entered a room unexpectedly. Daniel felt it every time Emma glanced at her phone just a little too quickly. Something intangible had shifted, and both sensed it without fully understanding what it meant. But one person understood: Lina Rivera. From her apartment in Capitol Hill, Lina watched the growing strain between Emma and Daniel play out through messages and calls that carried increasing fear in Emma's voice. Lina urged caution. She encouraged Emma to seek emotional support. She reminded her that none of this was Emma's fault, but she also maintained distance, knowing proximity had already brought them too close to danger once before. For a brief time, the situation seemed stable, not peaceful but manageable. Emma stayed guarded, Lina stayed cautious, Daniel stayed watchful. But suspicion is not static, it evolves. Daniel didn't know who he was suspicious of, not yet. He didn't know a name, an identity, or even the nature of the connection Emma was hiding. But he sensed something, and that unspecific dread became a burning need for clarity. It was late March when the turning point came. Investigators would later attempt to reconstruct the timeline, piecing together digital footprints, phone records, and witness testimony. What emerged was not a confirmed truth, but a constellation of events that suggested a pattern, a trajectory toward a confrontation none of them could undo. It began with the phone calls. According to investigative findings, Daniel made several late-night calls to a number not saved in his contacts. The calls came after he went through the family phone bill, identifying unfamiliar numbers Emma had dialed or received messages from. He did not confront Emma directly about them. Instead, he called the number himself. That number belonged to Lina. The content of those calls was never recorded, but based on testimony from Lina's friends and details discovered during the investigation, the calls were described as angry, accusatory, and directed at a woman Daniel believed was interfering in their marriage. Whether Daniel understood the full extent of Emma and Lina's emotional connection remains unclear, but investigators later concluded that he likely suspected it was more than mere friendship. Lina told a close friend that the calls frightened her. She described Daniel's voice as controlled but edged with simmering emotion, not shouting, not threatening outright, but charged with the kind of conviction that made her feel unsafe. She ended the calls quickly, but they continued intermittently over the next week. Emma never knew. She sensed Daniel's tension, but had no idea he had begun reaching beyond the walls of their home, tracing her emotional world through phone records and suspicion. Then came the night Daniel appeared at Lina's apartment building. It was a cold, rainy evening in early April. The security footage from Lina's building, grainy and angled poorly, captured only a vague outline: a man matching Daniel's height and general build standing near the entrance, checking the call box, glancing repeatedly toward the sidewalk. The camera caught only a partial profile under the shadow of a hood. It was not clear whether he gained access to the building, but several residents later told investigators they heard someone moving through the hallway with a heavy, deliberate stride. Around that same time, neighbors reported hearing raised voices in the hallway outside Lina's apartment. Some described it as an argument, others described it only as tense conversation. No one could identify the man present, but several recalled hearing Lina say, "please," in a strained tone. None of the witnesses intervened. In Seattle, in apartment buildings where neighbors drift in and out of their own focused routines, people tended to stay behind closed doors unless a situation reached unmistakable urgency. But urgency is subjective. Investigators later found a window near Lina's fire escape shattered. It was unclear whether someone had broken it intentionally or whether an object had struck it during the confrontation. The glass scattered onto the metal landing below, glistening in rain like broken ice. Later that night, Lina sent a text to a close friend. She said she felt frightened. No other details, no elaboration, just fear. Her friend responded immediately, urging her to call the police, to stay with someone she trusted, to avoid being alone. She responded with reassurance she didn't fully feel. She said she would stay at home that night but lock the doors and keep her phone close. She didn't say Daniel's name, not directly, but she said, "Someone came by. I didn't expect it. I'm okay, but shaken." Investigators would return to that message many times. They would scrutinize it, analyze it, question whether it indicated a clear threat or merely discomfort. But in the end, it remained a vague artifact, meaningful, but not definitive. That same night, Lina's car was found in the parking lot behind her building with all 4 tires deflated. Not slashed, not punctured, simply deflated, deliberately, methodically. No surveillance camera caught the act, and no witnesses came forward. The act itself was subtle, but intentional. The kind of action someone might take not to harm, but to immobilize. Whether this was connected to the confrontation remains unknown. Investigators could not prove it, but the timing raised suspicions they could not dismiss. When asked later, Daniel denied any involvement. He said he had never gone near Lina's building, never called her, never confronted anyone. His explanations changed over time, shifting subtly as new evidence was presented. None of his statements were definitively disproven, but inconsistencies emerged like cracks in concrete. Lina's friends grew increasingly concerned. She told one friend that she didn't want to pull Emma deeper into the situation, even though she cared deeply for her. She believed Emma was already under too much strain at home. She believed any escalation might cause harm, not just to herself but to Emma. Out of that protective instinct, she distanced herself. For several days, Lina avoided messaging Emma frequently. She responded to Emma's texts warmly but succinctly, trying not to reveal the fear gnawing at her. She didn't want Emma to blame herself for the confrontation at the apartment building. She didn't want Emma to feel responsible. But Emma sensed something. She sensed the shorter messages. She sensed the subtle withdrawal. She sensed the way Lina's usual warmth, though still present, was edged with fatigue. Emma asked if something was wrong. Lina reassured her. She said everything was fine. She said she was just overwhelmed at work. She believed her, because she wanted to. But the truth was already in motion. The events of that night marked a shift, a turning point, a moment when fear began to merge with danger in a way Lina did not fully recognize until it was too late. And then came the moment Seattle would never forget. The blurry figure. A distant security camera mounted on the adjacent building captured a hooded individual walking along the alley behind Lina's apartment, around 11:48 p.m. The image was low resolution, distorted by raindrops on the lens and dim street lighting. The figure paused briefly near Lina's window, then moved out of frame. Investigators could not confirm the identity. The figure could have been anyone, a passerby, a neighbor, a stranger, or someone connected to Lina's life. But the timing again raised questions. The next morning, the world had already shifted. Lina Rivera disappeared. She wasn't in her apartment, though her belongings remained. Her phone stopped transmitting after 12:02 p.m., a short time after its last known connection to a cell tower near her residence. Her wallet remained in her purse, her keys were on the counter. Only she was missing. No one saw her leave. No one heard her. No surveillance camera captured her departure. Her friend said she was planning to meet one of them the next afternoon. She never arrived. She didn't answer calls. She didn't respond to messages. She simply vanished into the shadows of Seattle's sprawling night. Investigators would later describe the timeline as fragmented but chilling, a series of events that could not be dismissed as coincidence, yet could not be proven as direct causation. Daniel was questioned extensively. His explanations varied but never fully aligned with the evidence. He admitted to tension in his marriage, but denied contacting Lina or visiting her home. Emma, racked with shock and confusion, struggled to provide details about her emotional involvement with Lina. She withheld certain truths out of fear and guilt, truths that investigators had to uncover, slowly, carefully, painstakingly. But the central fact remained. After that night in 2018, Lina Rivera disappeared without a trace. No confirmed sightings, no digital activity, no financial transactions, no communication. She vanished from her life, as though the city itself had swallowed her whole. And the last known events before her disappearance were steeped in fear, conflict, and an emotional triangle no one fully understood until it was too late. The investigation had only begun.
The morning after Lina Rivera disappeared, Seattle woke to its usual curtain of fog rolling in from Elliott Bay. Ferries sounded their deep horns, buses hissed along wet pavement, and the city continued its indifferent rhythms. But within a small apartment on Capitol Hill, a silence more profound than any morning mist settled over Lina's empty living room. A silence that would soon capture the attention of investigators, journalists, and an entire community. The first call came from a close friend who had expected to meet Lina that afternoon. When she couldn't reach her by phone, and when Lina failed to appear for their planned walk through Volunteer Park, concern turned into alarm. Lina was reliable. She was attentive. She did not disappear without explanation. The friend contacted another and another, until the collective worry grew too intense to ignore. By evening, the Seattle Police Department had received an official missing person report. Officers were dispatched to Lina's apartment. They knocked. They waited. They announced themselves. When there was no response, they entered the unit with the authorization provided in missing person investigations involving potential danger. Inside, they found stillness. Her bed was made. Her purse sat on the counter. Her wallet lay inside, undisturbed. Her keys were in their usual ceramic bowl near the door. A book rested open on the sofa, its page held by a small hair tie. 2 mugs sat in the sink, one rinsed, one not. Her phone charger was plugged into the outlet beside her bed, but the phone itself was missing. Nothing suggested voluntary disappearance. Nothing suggested violence. It was as though she had stepped out of her home for only a moment and never returned. From that point on, the investigation grew deeper, wider, and increasingly complex. Detectives began assembling a timeline, pulling phone records, interviewing friends and neighbors, and examining every piece of evidence they could find. But as they pieced together Lina's final known hours on the night she vanished, they discovered troubling patterns. Patterns that pointed toward tension, confrontation, and emotional turbulence that had gone unseen by the public. The first significant clue came from Lina's phone. Its last recorded activity was a ping to a cell tower less than half a mile from her apartment building. The timing placed it minutes after the blurry figure captured on the distant security camera passed near her window. Whether Lina was carrying the phone at that moment, or whether someone else held it, remained unclear. Investigators could not determine whether she left the building voluntarily or under pressure, or if she left at all. What they did know was simple. The phone went silent shortly after midnight. No further pings, no texts, no calls, no GPS activity. It was as though the device had been powered off, destroyed, or dropped somewhere without signal. And in a city as populated and connected as Seattle, that absence was chilling. As detectives attempted to reconstruct Lina's relationships, they learned about Emma Parker,
the woman whose name appeared repeatedly in Lina's private messages. Friends testified that Lina had spoken warmly about Emma, describing her with deep affection and gentle admiration. They described the connection as emotionally significant, supportive, and genuine. They also described Lina's fear in the days leading up to her disappearance, fear linked not to Emma, but to Emma's husband, Daniel. When detectives interviewed Emma, she revealed only fragments of the truth, not because she wished to deceive, but because she was terrified of how the full story might be used, terrified of the implications, terrified of the possibility that her emotional connection with Lina had contributed to the events that unfolded. Emma admitted knowing Lina. She admitted caring for her deeply, but she did not initially disclose the encounter on the day when Lina hid inside the narrow utility chase. She did not reveal the late-night messages, the emotional intimacy, and the growing closeness she had not fully understood until it was too late. Detectives sensed her withholding information. Her voice trembled. Her eyes shifted. She spoke with guilt coiled around every word, but she maintained that she had no involvement in Lina's disappearance, and investigators found no evidence linking her directly. Her grief appeared sincere. Her fear appeared real, but her silence, intentional or not, complicated the search. Daniel Parker, in contrast, approached the investigation with stark detachment. When questioned, he denied contacting Lina, denied visiting her apartment building, denied having any confrontations with her. His manner was calm, controlled, polite, but investigators noted inconsistencies. His timeline for the evening Lina disappeared shifted across multiple interviews. Small details changed. Alibis grew vague. When detectives showed him the blurry security footage of a hooded figure outside Lina's building, he stated the individual could be anyone, which was true. But when they asked if he had ever been near Capitol Hill that week, his answers became imprecise. There was no definitive evidence implicating him, but there was no clarity exonerating him. Friends of Lina provided more context. They spoke of angry calls she had received from an unknown number, calls that late-night phone records later linked to Daniel's phone. They spoke of the confrontation in her apartment hallway. They described how shaken she had been, how she had admitted to feeling frightened, and how she had intended to take precautions. But fear, as detectives reminded the public, is not proof of crime. Investigators faced a dilemma: evidence suggesting conflict, but nothing indisputable. Suspicion, but no certainty. Emotion, but no forensic trail. The narrow, vertical utility chase inside the Parker home, the hidden shaft where Lina had once hidden, became an eerie symbol in the case. It represented the secrecy that had defined the weeks leading up to Lina's disappearance. Secrets hidden behind walls, emotions confined to narrow spaces, truths squeezed into silence. Detectives examined the utility chase months after Lina vanished. They found dust displaced, small fibers caught on a pipe, slight scuff marks inconsistent with routine maintenance. Emma eventually admitted the truth, that Lina had hidden there during Daniel's unexpected arrival. She revealed the terror of that moment, the near discovery, the escape. The revelation added emotional weight to the investigation, but provided little usable forensic evidence. The chase was too common a structure, too accessible, too exposed to environmental changes. Nothing found inside could serve as proof of wrongdoing. Still, detectives documented it meticulously. They photographed the pipes, the insulation, the shaft walls. The space became part of the case file, a strange, claustrophobic footnote in a story with no clear resolution. As investigators dug deeper into Daniel's explanations, more inconsistencies emerged. His accounts of his movements fluctuated. His descriptions of his marriage shifted subtly with each interview. At times, he portrayed Emma distant. At others, he depicted their relationship as stable. He claimed ignorance of her emotional world, while simultaneously suspecting she had grown secretive. None of this was criminal, but it raised questions.
Emma, for her part, eventually broke down during one interview. She admitted she had hidden details out of fear. Fear of Daniel's reaction, fear of being blamed for Lina's disappearance, fear of acknowledging the full depth of her feelings for Lina. She insisted she had nothing to do with Lina's vanishing, and investigators found no evidence contradicting her. Her guilt was emotional, not evidentiary. Still, the shame weighed on her profoundly. Meanwhile, investigators followed every possible lead. They searched parks, abandoned buildings, waterfront areas where transients sometimes passed through. They examined ferry logs, surveillance footage from transit centers, rideshare data. They searched wooded trails near Discovery Park, the industrial stretches of Sodo, the waterfront piers. They found nothing. No trace of Lina, no body, no belongings, no conclusive digital footprint. It was as though she dissolved into the fog that night and left no shadow behind. The LGBTQ+ nature of Emma and Lina's relationship was handled with care by investigators and journalists alike. They emphasized the dignity and authenticity of their bond, acknowledging it as a central emotional truth in Lina's story, not as a sensational detail, but as a profoundly human connection. Friends testified to the respect and sincerity between the two women, describing the relationship as rooted in shared vulnerability and trust. Detectives treated this context with seriousness, recognizing that love, fear, and emotional conflict can shape actions in ways not always visible on the surface. But even with compassion and determination guiding the investigation, the case reached an impasse. Months passed, leads ran cold, witness memories grew foggy, digital traces went stale. Public interest surged, then faded, then returned with the release of new findings. Online forums buzzed with theories, some compassionate, some reckless, some harmful. But no theory crossed the threshold from speculation to fact. Daniel Parker moved out of the home he once shared with Emma.
Neighbors said he seemed withdrawn, quieter than before, sometimes pacing outside late at night as though searching for answers that wouldn't come. He denied wrongdoing in every public and private statement. He lived under a cloud of suspicion, but never under formal accusation. Emma remained in Seattle, but carried her grief privately. She attended therapy. She attempted to rebuild her life. She walked through her home with the weight of memories pressed into every corner, especially the hallway where the access panel to the utility chase remained closed, silent, and unaltered. She often paused there, staring at the panel, knowing it symbolized far more than a hidden cavity in a house. It represented the moment when everything might have changed, the moment when danger brushed close enough to touch, the moment that, in some ways, defined the rest of her life. What investigators were left with was a story composed of fragments. Fragments of fear, fragments of confrontation, fragments of love, fragments of suspicion. But no body, no charges, no closure, and no definitive truth. Only the haunting absence of a woman who deserved safety, dignity, and the life she was building with quiet courage. Only the echo of a final phone ping. Only the silence of a city that swallowed her whole.
Years have passed since the night Lina Rivera vanished into the quiet fabric of Seattle. The city has continued its familiar rhythm, ferries drifting across Elliott Bay, the hum of Pike Place Market, the distant glow of the Space Needle illuminating fog-thickened skies. But for those who knew her, for those who loved her, and for those who investigated her disappearance, time has done little to soften the ache of unanswered questions. The case remains open, suspended in a delicate balance between possibility and silence. Inside the Seattle Police Department's cold case storage, a box labeled with Lina's name holds the fragments of an investigation that never reached its conclusion. Photographs of her apartment, copies of her last text messages, blurry stills of a hooded figure, transcripts of interviews with Emma and Daniel Parker, forensic notes from the narrow architectural cavity where she once hid.
These objects reveal moments, emotions, suspicions, but not truth. What makes Lina's disappearance so haunting is not only the lack of evidence, but the presence of so many near truths. Her story is defined not by what investigators found, but by the spaces between what they could not. None of the evidence was strong enough to lead to charges. None of the interviews were definitive enough to form conclusions. None of the forensic traces told a full story. Everything remained incomplete. Shadows without sources, echoes without origins, threads that never formed a tapestry. To understand the unresolved nature of the case, investigators revisited the timeline again and again, examining every shift in behavior, every confrontation, every moment of fear that preceded Lina's disappearance. They looked again at the emotionally distant marriage between Emma and Daniel Parker, a relationship that had slowly decayed into silence long before Lina entered Emma's life. They studied Emma's messages, her grief, her honesty, belated but sincere. They considered how guilt can distort memory, how trauma can create cracks in truth, how love can complicate the simplest questions. Emma remained central to the story, but never as a suspect. Every piece of evidence about her involvement came back to the same conclusion. She had loved Lina, she had feared Daniel, and she had been paralyzed by a situation she never meant to create. Her withheld information had impeded the investigation, but had not changed its ultimate trajectory. She lived with that weight every day, in a quiet house that felt emptier than ever before. Daniel Parker's role in the events surrounding Lina's disappearance remained a clouded mystery. Investigators traced every inconsistency in his statements, every suspicious movement, every possible motive rooted in jealousy, pride, or perceived betrayal. They examined his late-night calls to Lina, his angry tone as reported by friends, his presence near Lina's apartment on the night of the confrontation. But suspicion, even deep suspicion, is not evidence. Daniel maintained his innocence throughout, denying any wrongdoing, denying any confrontation beyond a concern for his marriage, denying any involvement in Lina's vanishing. He insisted that he never harmed her, that he never followed her, that he never stepped foot near her building on the night she disappeared. Without further evidence, the investigation stalled. In the years after the disappearance, Daniel moved twice within Washington state, eventually settling in a small town outside Spokane. Public records show employment changes and a gradual withdrawal from community involvement. Some described him as somber, others as defensive, but none could say for certain who he was after 2018, a grieving husband blindsided by emotional betrayal, or a man hiding a truth too heavy to speak. Emma, by contrast, remained in Seattle. She continued therapy. She built small routines, gentle routines, morning walks near Green Lake, afternoons in cafes where she could exist anonymously, evenings passing quietly in a home she could not bring herself to leave. The rooms carried memories she was not ready to abandon. The walls held echoes she could not silence. Most haunting of all was the utility chase. The narrow, vertical, mechanical shaft, once a mundane architectural feature, had become a symbolic monument to everything that had gone wrong. Investigators had photographed it, studied it, measured it, but left it unchanged. Emma never sealed the panel, never repainted it, never attempted to alter the physical reminder of the moment Lina's life brushed up against danger. People rarely think of the architecture of a home as part of a mystery, but in this story, that hollow space behind the wall became as significant as any witness or piece of evidence. It embodied the hidden truths Emma carried. It stood as a metaphor for the relationship she and Lina had shared, intimate, concealed, fragile, and powerful. It represented secrets that had gone unspoken for too long. It symbolized a threshold Lina crossed once out of fear and from which she escaped alive, but she never escaped the shadows that followed. Neighbors eventually learned fragments of the story, the disappearance, the questions, the investigation. Some offered quiet sympathy. Others avoided the subject entirely. For Emma, their reactions blended into background noise. Her focus remained fixed on one truth. Lina was real. Her love was real. Her presence had changed Emma's life irrevocably. And yet, Lina was gone. With no body, no verified sightings, no trace of her movement after that final phone ping, investigators were left with the unsettling possibility that Lina had been taken, harmed, or frightened into disappearing. They also considered, though not likely, the possibility of voluntary flight, an attempt to escape a threat she believed might return. But Lina's strong connections to friends, her commitments to her work, her steady communication patterns, and her deeply rooted life in Seattle made that scenario improbable. Her absence felt forced, abrupt, wrong, and the city felt that wrongness. As months turned into years, the case gained periodic attention whenever a new lead surfaced, a possible sighting in Tacoma that went nowhere, a tip about a car matching Lina's parked near an abandoned property that turned out unrelated, fragments of information that flickered briefly before dissolving back into uncertainty. The lack of closure kept the story alive. Podcasts examined it, local journalists revisited it, community forums debated it, cold case detectives reviewed it, but none could provide what Lina's friends longed for most: answers. Why did she disappear? Who was the hooded figure on camera that night? Why did her phone go silent so abruptly? How did she leave her home without being seen? Did she leave willingly or under threat? And most haunting of all, what truly happened in the hours after she texted that she felt afraid? Each question led to another. Each door opened into another hallway of uncertainty. Each theory carried equal weight and equal fragility. But the mystery did more than confound investigators. It transformed the lives of those left behind. Emma especially bore a quiet sorrow that shaped the rest of her days. She lived with the knowledge that Lina had come into her life at a moment of deep emotional need and had vanished before Emma could fully step into the truth she had been too afraid to speak. She lived with guilt over the secrecy, over the fear, over everything she had not told detectives in those early days. She lived with a silence she could not explain. Daniel, too, lived with shadows, whether from guilt, grief, anger, or a truth yet untold. In the absence of confirmation, his role remained an unresolved thread in a story woven from incomplete evidence. But no matter how the threads were examined, they all converged on a single chilling fact. Lina Rivera, warm, confident, emotionally open, walked out of Emma Parker's house alive, and somewhere afterward, her trail vanished. The final scene of Lina's known life is not a moment captured on camera, not a final message, not a final conversation. It is an absence, a space, a void where answers should be, a place where truth lives in silence. Seattle carries many mysteries. Storm drains that swallow rainwater into unseen tunnels, abandoned industrial spaces hidden beneath downtown, old buildings with sealed rooms no one remembers, a city built with layers of history, each deeper and more complex than the last. But no place in Seattle's architecture is as haunting as that narrow utility chase inside the Parker home, the cavity in the wall where a life once hid, where fear once pressed close, where the shadows of danger once crept. It stands as a reminder of what was almost discovered, of what was almost revealed, of what was almost prevented, and of what ultimately remains unknown. Lina Rivera has been missing since 2018. Her body has never been found. No one has been charged. The file remains open. The truth remains hidden. Emma continues her life in quiet solitude, haunted by memories of love and loss she still cannot fully articulate. Daniel denies wrongdoing, speaking of the past as though the truth lies too deep to unearth. But the city remembers Lina through articles, vigils, podcasts, and whispers shared in coffee shops during rainy afternoons. Her friends remember her through the warmth she gave freely, a warmth that still lingers in the lives she touched. But the truth, whatever it is, remains in the shadows. And like the narrow shaft inside Emma's home, it remains closed, silent, and waiting. In 2018, Lina Rivera walked out of a house alive, but somewhere in the shadows, her trail vanished, and the truth, no matter how long it hides, still waits to be found. Share this story. keep her name alive, because someone, somewhere, knows what happened to Lina Rivera, and the truth should never be allowed to disappear.